I remember the exact moment the world tilted. It wasn't a grand explosion or a thunderclap, just a single text message that made my hands tremble so hard I nearly dropped my phone. Can't wait to see you tonight. Those 7 words, so ordinary, so harmless, and yet they carried the weight of everything I'd been hiding from myself for years. I'd agreed to this date on a whim, or maybe out of a quiet hunger I could no longer deny. I told myself it was a joke, an experiment, just something to do for fun. But as the hours crept toward evening and I stared at the neatly folded dress lying across my bed, I felt that this night was going to split my life into before and after. The air in my room was heavy with perfume and hesitation. My reflection in the mirror looked back at me with an expression that wasn't mine, or maybe it was the real me, finally surfacing. My heart beat against my ribs like it was trying to break free. I traced my fingers over the soft fabric, the smooth wig that shimmered under the light, the small collection of makeup brushes I'd learned to use in secret late at night when the world was asleep. No one knew about this part of me. Not my friends. Not my coworkers. Not even my reflection until recently. For months I'd watched tutorials in silence, absorbing every detail like it was sacred knowledge. I'd practiced the way to walk in heels down the narrow hallway of my apartment, each wobbling step a strange combination of embarrassment and exhilaration. And now, here I was on the edge of actually living it. The dress wasn't extravagant, just a soft blush color with a subtle floral print that caught the light when I moved. When I slipped it over my head, the sensation made me close my eyes. It was light, gentle, comforting, almost like being seen for the first time. I took a slow breath, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders, and then studied my reflection again. My lips trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. I don't think I'd ever realized how much of my life had been spent performing a version of myself that didn't fit. Tonight was supposed to be a harmless bit of make-believe, a cross-dressing experiment, a disguise. But looking at myself now, I realized the disguise wasn't the dress. It had been everything else. And that terrified me. The knock on the door came earlier than I expected. My pulse spiked. I almost tore off the wig, ready to throw everything back into the closet and pretend none of this had ever happened. But something inside me, fragile, determined, whispered, "Not this time." I walked to the door on trembling legs, heels clicking against the floor like the ticking of a countdown. When I opened it, the cool night air rushed in, and with it came a moment that would change everything I thought I knew about myself. He was standing there with that easy, confident smile that always made people trust him, though I doubted he had any idea what was really behind my eyes that night. His name was Daniel, and he'd known me for months, but never like this. "Wow," he said softly, his voice catching for just a second. "You look amazing." I wanted to laugh, or cry, or maybe just dissolve into the evening air and let it carry me away. Because those words, "you look amazing," were meant for someone I wasn't supposed to be. Yet somehow, for the first time in my life, I wanted to believe them. "Thanks," I said, trying to steady my voice, hoping he wouldn't notice how my hands shook. We stood there awkwardly for a few seconds before he offered his arm. It was such a simple gesture, old-fashioned and sweet, and when I took it, the warmth of his sleeve under my palm sent a quiet shock through me. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was real. The streets glowed under the orange haze of streetlights. My heels clicked in rhythm with his steps, a small symphony of courage and fear. I could feel the eyes of strangers brushing past, their glances like cold wind against my skin. Every sound, every whisper felt amplified, as though the entire world had turned its attention toward me. "Are you okay?" he asked after a while, noticing the stiffness in my movements. "Yeah," I lied. "Just nervous." He smiled, not pushing further. First dates usually do that. If only he knew how many layers that sentence had. We stopped by a small cafe tucked away between 2 old buildings, the kind with soft lights, faded posters, and that warm smell of roasted coffee beans that makes time slow down. Inside, the air felt safer, quieter. I could breathe again. When I caught our reflection in the window, him, relaxed and effortlessly himself, me, a careful construction of foundation, eyeliner, and fragile courage, It hit me that this was the first time I'd ever sat across from someone as her. As me. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," he said, stirring his coffee. It was a game we used to play. I froze. My mind raced for an answer that would keep me safe. Something light, funny, harmless. But my heart whispered something else, a truth so heavy it trembled to be spoken. I looked down at my cup, watching the ripples shimmer under the light. "I think," I said slowly, "I've been pretending for a really long time. And tonight, I just wanted to see who I could be if I stopped." He didn't answer right away. Just watched me, not with confusion, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet recognition. Like he understood, even if he didn't have the words for it. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it started to loosen its grip. Because maybe, just maybe, being seen wasn't as dangerous as I'd always believed. When I got home that night, I didn't turn the lights on right away. I just stood there in the dark, letting the quiet hum of the city seep through the window. My reflection in the glass was faint, ghostly, the outline of someone caught between two worlds. The makeup was still perfect, the wig slightly askew from the breeze, but my eyes, they looked alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. I sat down on the edge of my bed, the blush-colored dress folding softly around me, and let the weight of the night sink in. Nothing monumental had happened, no declarations, no big reveals, and yet, everything inside me felt rearranged. It was like Daniel's words, his simple kindness, had given permission to a part of me that had been waiting in silence. My phone buzzed. A message. "I had a really good time tonight." I stared at it for a long time before replying. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure which version of me should answer. The one the world knew, or the one I'd met in the mirror just hours ago. "Me too. Thank you." I hit send before I could overthink it. Then I looked at myself again, really looked. I leaned closer to the mirror, studying every tiny detail, the soft edges of my jawline under the makeup, the way the eyeliner reshaped my eyes, the faint trembling of my lips that didn't quite know how to smile yet. I felt like an artist and a canvas all at once. But beneath the surface beauty, there was a storm, a quiet panic whispering. What now? Because I couldn't go back. Not really. Over the next few days, I tried. I shoved the dress to the back of the closet, scrubbed away every trace of foundation, and went back to my usual clothes, plain jeans, hoodies, a face stripped of color. Everyone at work treated me the same. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt wrong. My own reflection started to feel like a stranger again. When Daniel texted me a few days later, "Want to grab coffee again?" My heart did that wild, terrified leap. I said yes before my brain had a chance to stop me. This time, I didn't overthink the outfit. I didn't hide behind excuses. I just wanted to feel right again, even for a little while. When I walked into the cafe, Daniel was already there. He looked up, smiled, and his eyes softened in that way that made the whole world fade. "I was hoping you'd come as yourself again," he said quietly. I blinked, confused, caught between relief and fear. "You mean?" He nodded. "Yeah, you. The way you were that night." It was such a simple statement, but it landed in me like a spark hitting dry kindling. I felt the warmth spread, cautious but unstoppable. I didn't know what name to give her, the person he saw, the person I was starting to recognize, but I knew she was real. And she wanted to exist, no matter how messy, complicated, or terrifying it might become. For the first time in a long while, I felt something that wasn't shame or confusion. I felt hope. The morning after that second coffee, I woke before the sun. It wasn't the usual restless anxiety that dragged me out of bed. It was something lighter, a pulse of quiet anticipation, like I was standing on the edge of a truth I hadn't yet spoken aloud. I brewed coffee and watched the sky slowly brighten, streaks of pink and gold sliding between the buildings. For the first time, I caught my reflection in the window and didn't immediately look away. My hair was messy, my eyes tired, but there was a softness there. A quiet knowing. That day, I decided to stop hiding from myself. Not to announce anything to the world, not to make a spectacle, just to stop lying to the mirror. I started small. A neutral nail polish. Softer colors. Subtle mascara when I went out. Nothing dramatic, but enough that when I caught my reflection in a shop window, I felt a flicker of recognition instead of discomfort. Every small act felt like a rebellion, and also like a homecoming. Daniel noticed, of course. We started seeing each other more often, not dates exactly, just time spent. Walks, late-night talks, quiet dinners where the conversation would drift from books to music to that unspoken something between us that neither of us dared to define. One evening, after we'd walked along the river and the city lights rippled on the water, he turned to me and said, "You seem lighter lately. Happier." I wanted to tell him everything. The fear, the confusion, the nights spent crying in front of my mirror because I didn't know how to exist in a world that only accepted one version of me. But instead, I smiled and said, "I think I'm starting to understand who I am." He nodded, as if that was enough. Maybe it was. But not everyone saw it that way. The first crack came from a friend, someone I'd known for years. She laughed one day, pointing at the faint shimmer of lip gloss I'd forgotten to wipe off. "What's this? You turning into someone else now," she joked. I tried to laugh it off, but the way she said someone else stung. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying her words. Maybe she didn't mean anything by it. Maybe she did. But it reminded me how fragile this new version of me still was, like a painting that could be ruined by one careless touch. Still, the next morning I put the lip gloss back on. Not to prove a point, but because I refused to disappear again. Daniel texted me later that day. "Dinner tonight?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want to go, but because I knew the world outside wasn't always kind. The more I stepped into myself, the more visible I became. And visibility was both freedom and risk. But I said yes, because hiding had already cost me too much. As I stood in front of the mirror that evening, putting on the same blush-colored dress from that first night, I realized it wasn't just a dress anymore. It was memory, courage, and promise woven into fabric. And when I walked out the door, I carried with me the quiet certainty that I was no longer running from who I was walking toward her. The restaurant Daniel chose that night was small and warm, with dim amber lights that painted everything in soft gold. The kind of place where you could almost forget the rest of the world existed. When I walked in, he stood to greet me, a quiet, instinctive gesture that somehow said more than words could. "You look beautiful," he said simply. I laughed, partly from nerves. "You always say that." "That's because it's always true." There was no hesitation in his tone, no awkwardness. Just the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted what I was still learning to embrace. We sat down, and I could feel the soft thrum of my pulse in every fingertip. For a while, we talked about normal things, work, movies, the rain that had been threatening all week but never arrived. But under the surface of every sentence was a current I couldn't ignore. He was seeing me, not the performance, not the disguise, but the person who'd been slowly blooming through the cracks of fear. When the waiter left us alone again, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, "the first night we met like this, I didn't know what to expect. But you seemed free, like someone who'd finally exhaled after holding their breath for years." I looked down, tracing the rim of my glass with a fingertip. "That's exactly what it felt like." He smiled. "Then keep breathing." Those two words hit deeper than I expected. It wasn't a command, it was permission. Permission to exist without apology. After dinner, we walked outside. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of rain and city lights. The streets shimmered faintly under the glow of street lamps. We didn't talk much, didn't need to. Every step beside him felt like the world quietly adjusting to let me belong in it. At one point, a group of strangers passed us. I saw their glances, curious, assessing. That familiar rush of anxiety tried to creep in, the instinct to shrink, to disappear. But Daniel's hand brushed against mine, not grabbing, not forcing, just there, steady. And somehow that was enough. When we reached my building, we stopped by the door. The moment felt suspended, fragile as glass. "Thank you," I said softly. For dinner? For not making me feel like a secret. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You're not. You never were." I wanted to believe that. More than anything, I wanted to believe it. Because for so long, I had lived like my reflection was something to hide, not something to honor. That night, when I took off my makeup and looked in the mirror again, I didn't see two versions of myself anymore. I saw one, imperfect, scared, alive. And she was smiling. The days that followed unfolded like a slow sunrise, soft, uncertain, and strangely beautiful. I could feel something in me rearranging, as if every breath I took was pulling a hidden part of myself into the light. It wasn't a grand change, more like quiet ripples spreading through my daily life. Each morning, I caught my reflection before leaving for work, a touch of lip balm, a careful sweep of mascara, the faint pink scarf I'd come to love. It wasn't about trying to impress anyone. It was about claiming the small spaces of my identity that had waited too long to exist. I wasn't pretending anymore. I was finally becoming. Daniel was the calm thread woven through it all. He never demanded explanations. He just noticed things, the lighter tone in my voice, the way I smiled without thinking, how I no longer avoided my own reflection. His presence felt like gravity, keeping me steady when the ground beneath me shifted. But not every world welcomed quiet revolutions. One gray afternoon, I was walking home when I heard my name. Two coworkers stood at the corner, umbrellas in hand, surprise flickering across their faces when they recognized me. I felt the air tighten. My scarf suddenly felt too bright, my voice too soft. We exchanged a few polite words, meaningless fragments about weather and work, but I could feel it in their glances, the unspoken questions, the discomfort they didn't know how to hide. When they walked away, I stood there for a long moment, rain beginning to fall, mascara threatening to blur. The next day at the office, the air felt thinner. People still smiled, but something invisible had shifted, as if they'd all agreed to quietly adjust the distance between us. That evening, I found myself at Daniel's apartment. I didn't plan to go, but my feet took me there anyway, pulled by some quiet instinct for safety. He opened the door, saw my face, and said nothing, just guided me inside. I told him everything. Every small humiliation, every hesitant glance, every wordless reminder that the world had its own definitions of normal, and I didn't quite fit them. He listened the way he always did, not to respond, but to understand. When I finished, my voice barely more than a whisper, he said, "You know, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's walking through it anyway." "I don't feel courageous," I said. He smiled gently. "That's how I know you are." The words sank deep, like warmth seeping into cold skin. Later, we walked together through the park. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and leaves. Street lamps reflected off puddles like tiny mirrors, each one catching fragments of light. I watched our reflections ripple beside us, distorted and shimmering, and thought, maybe this is what transformation really looks like, imperfect, shifting, and alive. Daniel looked at me, really looked, and said quietly, "When I see you like this, I see someone brave." And for the first time, I didn't flinch away from that word. Because maybe bravery wasn't loud or certain. Maybe it was just this, standing in the rain, terrified and trembling, yet still choosing to be seen. The world outside my window looked muted that morning, as if the city itself had paused to take a breath. I watched the clouds drift like pale smoke across the sky, sipping my coffee and wondering when exactly the weight inside me had started to feel lighter. It wasn't that the fear had disappeared. It never truly did. But it had softened. It no longer controlled me the way it used to. Somewhere between all the hesitations and half-steps, I had begun to build a version of myself that felt less like an invention and more like a home. I met Daniel later that day at a quiet art gallery. The place was nearly empty, just the sound of shoes brushing against the floor and the occasional hum of the air conditioner. He loved this gallery, said it reminded him that silence could still tell stories. We wandered slowly, the air cool and clean, stopping in front of a painting that was nothing more than shades of pale pink and gray blending into one another. It's strange, he said softly, how something so simple can still feel alive. I nodded, staring at the brushstrokes. It feels like movement without direction, like it's still figuring out what it's supposed to be.
He turned to me.
Kind of like you. I laughed quietly, the sound catching somewhere between amusement and disbelief. That's one way to put it. You're always trying to define yourself, he said, but maybe you don't need to. Maybe you just need to live in it. Something about those words settled deep in me. For so long, I'd been obsessed with naming what I was labeling, explaining, defending. But maybe the truth didn't need a definition. Maybe it just needed to be felt. We sat on a bench for a while, surrounded by soft echoes and muted colors. I told him things I'd never said aloud before, how I used to stare at mirrors and feel like they were lying to me, how even now I sometimes woke up wondering if I was brave enough to keep becoming. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his presence quiet but grounding, like a steady hand on my shoulder. When I finally ran out of words, he said, "You don't have to earn the right to be yourself.
You already are."
For a long moment, I couldn't answer. My throat tightened, my chest filled with something warm and fragile. The gallery lights reflected faintly in my eyes, blurring the world into color and light. That was the moment I realized I wasn't fighting to become someone new. I was simply allowing the person I'd always been to step forward. Later, as we walked out into the fading afternoon, the air smelled faintly of rain and lilac. The city felt softer, less like a battlefield and more like a possibility. I caught my reflection in a nearby window, hair tousled by the breeze, eyes bright and unguarded, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was pretending. I didn't feel like I was performing. I just felt whole. And Daniel, walking beside me, didn't need to say anything at all. The silence between us said enough, that I was seen, understood, and finally beginning to understand myself. The night that followed the gallery felt unusually still. I left the windows open and let the city breathe through them. The hum of traffic, the distant murmur of laughter, the slow rhythm of life carrying on below me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was watching that life from behind glass. I felt inside it. I sat at my dressing table with a small round mirror tilted toward me. The light was soft and kind. I didn't reach for makeup right away. I just looked, really looked, at the person staring back. The traces of my day were still there. A hint of eyeliner, a stray hair from the wig that had slipped loose, the faintest shadow of fatigue under my eyes. But beneath all that was something that startled me, peace. It was strange how peace could feel so fragile, like holding a bubble you were afraid to break. I touched the mirror gently with one fingertip, as if to make sure the person there was real. Later, Daniel called. "Can I come by for a bit?" When he arrived, he brought takeout and that quiet smile that always seemed to steady the air around him. We ate sitting cross-legged on the floor, the lights dimmed, the city flickering outside the window. "You've been quiet tonight," he said. "Not in a bad way," I answered. "Just full." He nodded. "Full's good. It means you're finally letting yourself feel things." We talked about nothing and everything, childhood stories, favorite songs, the weird way life sometimes builds you up just to tear you open. Every word seemed to settle easily, no pressure, no weight. After a while, I asked, "Do you ever wonder if people can really change?" He thought for a long moment. "Maybe it's not about changing," he said. "Maybe it's about remembering who you were before you forgot." The sentence stayed with me long after he left. When the door closed and the silence returned, I walked back to the mirror. I looked again, this time not searching for flaws or proof, but simply acknowledging presence, my own. I whispered Daniel's words under my breath, tasting their truth, remembering who I was before I forgot. That night, I wrote in my journal for hours. Not the usual lists of doubts or questions, just fragments of feeling. Words like light, becoming, stillness, truth. It felt like tracing the outline of a self that had always been there, waiting for me to stop running long enough to see her. When I finally went to bed, the city was quiet. I lay awake, my heart steady, no longer pounding with fear. For the first time, I didn't dream of escape. I dreamed of arrival. A week later, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding for months. It wasn't dramatic or grand, just a simple choice, but one that felt monumental. I wanted to step outside, in daylight, as her. Not for a night, not for a date, not in the protection of dim lights or soft shadows, but in the bright, honest sun. Morning light spilled across my room as I stood by the mirror, the same mirror that had witnessed my confusion, my fear, my first glimpses of truth. I dressed slowly, deliberately. The soft cardigan, the flowing skirt that brushed against my knees, the faint shimmer of gloss. Every movement felt sacred, each layer another affirmation. I exist. I am here. When I finally stepped outside, the air met me like a question. The street was alive, people passing, cars rushing, voices overlapping in the rhythm of an ordinary day. To them, I was just another face in the crowd. But to me, it felt like the first time I'd ever truly been seen. I walked with careful steps, each one both fragile and powerful. The city had always intimidated me, its noise, its scrutiny, its endless watching, but that morning, it felt different. The sunlight caught the windows, scattering gold across the sidewalks, and for once, I didn't shrink from it. I let it touch me. I stopped at a small cafe, the same one where Daniel and I had first talked. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered. The barista smiled, not a flicker of hesitation in her eyes.
Good morning, she said. Just that.
Two simple words that felt like the world whispering welcome. I sat by the window with my coffee, watching the world move, my reflection layered against it in the glass. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was looking at a mask. I was looking at someone who had earned her place, not through perfection or bravery, but through persistence. Through every small, trembling yes. When Daniel joined me later, he didn't say much. He just smiled, eyes warm, and I could see that he understood what this moment meant, that it wasn't about fashion or presentation, but about being seen on my own terms. We sat there quietly, sunlight spilling between us, the city humming outside. I said softly, for so long, I was afraid of what people would see. And now, he asked, now I'm more afraid of not seeing myself. He reached across the table, not to hold my hand, but to rest his fingers lightly near mine, close enough to feel, not enough to claim. A gesture that said, you're allowed to be exactly as you are. Outside, a breeze brushed the window, scattering the reflection across the glass. I watched it shimmer and fade and realized something beautiful. I didn't need the reflection anymore to prove I existed. Because I was finally living as the person I'd only dared to imagine. And she was no longer a secret. It's strange how a single moment can stretch until it feels like an entire lifetime. For me, that moment came a few evenings after the cafe. Standing at my window, the city spread below like a sea of lights, the same view I'd stared at countless times before. But this time, everything looked different, even though nothing had changed. Maybe the world hadn't shifted at all. Maybe I finally had. I could see my reflection faintly in the glass, the same eyes, the same faint smile. And yet not the same. The old tension that used to pull at the corners of my mouth was gone. What remained was stillness, not the hollow kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that blooms when you finally stop fighting yourself. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel.
Proud of you.
Always. I didn't reply right away. I just held the phone in my hand, reading the words over and over, feeling their warmth. It wasn't about romance anymore, not really. It was about recognition, about the quiet miracle of being seen without disguise. I stepped back from the window, turned off the lights, and the city's glow poured in, soft, gold, endless. The air felt alive against my skin, cool and real. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the fear, the laughter, the countless small choices that had seemed impossible at the time. I thought about the first night, the trembling hands, the dress laid across the bed like a secret I was afraid to touch. I thought about how much courage it had taken to open the door that evening. I smiled, because that moment wasn't an ending after all. It was the beginning of every moment that followed. I walked to the mirror one last time before bed. No makeup, no performance, just me. I whispered a quiet goodnight to the reflection, not because I needed her approval, but because she finally felt like home. And in that whisper, I understood, transformation isn't about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you've been all along, the parts of yourself that waited patiently for you to stop hiding. Outside, the city moved on, unknowing, uncaring, and that was okay. Because I knew, the secret date that changed my life wasn't about who I met. It was about who I finally met within myself. And she was here to stay.
Tulip.